April 17th, 1942, Detroit, Michigan. The factory air hung thick with the smell of oil and hot steel. Sparks showered from the welding lines, bouncing off metal boots and settling in the grooves of the concrete floor. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves of the massive plant, an ocean of corrugated metal and glass that stretched toward the gray horizon. Inside, hundreds of men worked in rhythm. The clank of wrenches, the hiss of pneumatic drills, the rumble of engines being tested for the first time. But these engines weren't meant for tanks. They were meant for tractors. Across the factory floor, a tall man in grease-streaked overalls adjusted his goggles and leaned over a 6-cylinder block bolted to a test stand. His name was Charlie Nash, an agricultural engineer from Illinois, who'd spent most of his life designing engines for the Continental Motors Company, a supplier for the tractors that plowed the heartland's fields. For years, he'd helped farmers get the most out of their machines. Efficient, simple, reliable engines that could start in the cold and run all day without complaint. Now, as he watched the dials quiver and the metal vibrate under power, he could barely believe where his work was headed. A uniformed officer, Major Robert Campbell, U.S. Army Ordnance Department, stood beside him, notebook in hand. "You're telling me," Campbell said, almost shouting over the noise, "this thing could push a 30-ton tank?" Charlie smirked. "If it can drag a steel plow through Missouri mud, Major, it can move your tank." The officer laughed, but only halfway. The war in Europe had changed everything. The U.S. Army needed tanks, thousands of them and fast. The M4 Sherman was rolling off production lines across the country, but engine supply had become a choke point. Aircraft engines were too complex, diesel variants too rare. And while the Army scrambled to find solutions, engineers like Charlie were being pulled from civilian life into one of the most ambitious industrial conversions in history. For the first time, the quiet hum of American agriculture was about to roar onto the battlefields of the world. The meeting that afternoon wasn't in an office. It was in a hangar filled with crates marked Ordnance Department, Detroit Arsenal. Charts were pinned to a plywood wall, cross-sections of tank hulls, engine layouts, torque curves scribbled in pencil. The problem was clear: the Sherman's heart was too complicated. The original engines, adapted from aircraft power plants, demanded precision machining and high-octane fuel, fine for planes, but unsustainable for mass armor production. That's where Charlie's engine came in. The Continental R975, originally a radial aircraft engine that had also powered farm tractors and industrial vehicles, had a secret advantage. It was simple, rugged, and easy to produce. Its design dated back to the 1930s, built for reliability over performance, exactly what the Army needed. Still, skeptics remained. "Tractor engines?" one executive scoffed. "You want to win a war with farm equipment?" Charlie didn't argue. He simply pointed to a stripped-down R975 on the test stand. "This engine starts in the dead of winter, runs on low-octane fuel, and every mechanic from Kansas to Kentucky knows how to fix it. That's how you win wars." The room fell silent. The officer nodded once. The decision was made, and just like that, the war machine of America turned toward the Midwest. Within weeks, the word went out: convert every available engine plant. Tractor engine blueprints were retooled for tank assembly. Foundries that once forged plowshares now cast armor housings. Farmers' sons found themselves working side by side with engineers, building power plants for machines they would soon drive into battle. In one of history's strangest ironies, the same engine that once broke the soil of America's farms would soon churn the fields of Europe under steel treads. And for Charlie Nash, that transformation was only the beginning. May 1942, Peoria, Illinois. The morning whistle of the Caterpillar Tractor Company cut through the damp spring air like a church bell. Steam rose from the rooftops, carrying the smell of hot grease and iron filings into the wind. Men poured through the gates, farm hands turned factory workers, sleeves rolled, lunch pails clattering, some still wearing their worn denim overalls beneath freshly issued coveralls stamped with War Production Board. To the untrained eye, nothing here looked like a war plant. The lines were still filled with bulldozer frames and tractor chassis, the kind that once built America's roads and levees. But look closer. New assembly stations were being installed. Technicians from Detroit supervised welders as they fitted Continental R975 radial engines into heavy steel mock-ups resembling tank hulls. Charlie Nash had been sent down from Michigan to coordinate the transition. His boots echoed across the concrete as he passed through the test bay, clipboard in hand. Each line he saw told a story. Farm equipment reimagined as armor, plowshares reborn as instruments of survival. At the far end of the hall, a group of young women, many of them former secretaries and farm wives, were riveting panels onto what would become the engine covers for the M4 Sherman. The rhythmic pop-pop-pop of their rivet guns harmonized with the thrum of the engines being tested nearby. The line between civilian and soldier blurred more each day. Charlie stopped beside one of the test benches, where an R975 was roaring to life. The sound was familiar but different. No longer the low, steady thrum of a tractor engine, but a wild, thunderous growl. A young mechanic, sweat cutting streaks through the soot on his face, shouted over the noise. "She's hitting 400 horsepower, sir. Can't believe this thing used to run a plow." Charlie grinned, feeling the vibration through the soles of his boots. "She's not plowing anymore, son." The U.S. war machine was hungry, desperately hungry for engines. Tank production targets soared higher every month. And while the design bureaus in Washington debated horsepower ratios and turret designs, it was the farmers and factory workers of the Midwest who made it happen. By summer, Continental Motors in Muskegon, Caterpillar in Peoria, and American Locomotive in Schenectady were all churning out thousands of these adapted engines. Tractor foundries worked around the clock, their smokestacks painting the sky black by noon. Each plant received its quota of parts, under the tight control of the War Production Board. Steel allocations, bearing shipments, carburetor assemblies. Every delay rippled through the entire supply chain. Charlie's team sometimes had to improvise, using modified oil filters or repurposed tractor flywheels when standard tank parts ran short. It wasn't glamorous work. It was gritty, relentless, industrial alchemy, turning the raw muscle of American agriculture into the mechanical heartbeats of tanks bound for the front. The logistics were staggering. Flatbed railcars carried engines eastward from the heartland to the Detroit tank arsenal, where they were dropped into Sherman hulls like organs into bodies. Engineers tested, tuned, and shipped them again, this time to ports in New Jersey, where Liberty ships waited to ferry them across the Atlantic. Each tank that rolled off the docks carried more than armor and firepower. It carried a piece of the American heartland of men who once harvested corn and now harvested steel. But for all the success, there were doubts. Reports trickled back from testing ranges: overheating, fouled spark plugs, poor performance in desert sand. These engines were never meant to climb dunes or push through North African heat. Some officers wanted to abandon the design altogether. Yet Charlie fought back. He reworked cooling systems, improved filtration, and trained maintenance crews to adapt. "You don't abandon a good engine," he told the ordnance men. "You teach it to fight." By late 1942, his efforts paid off. A new version, the R975C1, proved reliable under combat conditions. It could take a hit, run on bad fuel, and keep a Sherman rolling when everything else failed. Somewhere in the endless din of industry, amid the clang of hammer on steel and the wail of locomotive whistles, the heartbeat of the Sherman tank was born loud, defiant, unstoppable. And soon, that heartbeat would echo across the deserts of Africa and the hedgerows of France. February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind was a knife, hot, dry, and cruel. Dust hung in the air, clinging to goggles, filling mouths, choking engines. Across the ochre hills of North Africa, the sound of tank treads rolled like thunder. The men of the 1st Armored Division crouched low inside their M4 Sherman tanks, the interior stifling, reeking of oil, cordite, and sweat. Sergeant Tom Riley, a 26-year-old from Iowa, sat in the driver's seat of a tank nicknamed Daisy May. The name was painted in looping white letters on the hull, a nod to the girlfriend he'd left behind, and perhaps to the farm tractor he'd once driven through her family's fields. "Keep her steady, Riley," the commander barked. "They're sighting us in." A shell screamed past, detonating in a geyser of sand. The tank shuddered, but Riley's hands stayed firm on the controls. Beneath him, the Continental R975 radial engine howled, its cylinders spinning like the heart of a storm. He couldn't see the battle. The narrow slits of the vision blocks offered only flashes of the world outside, but he could feel it. Every vibration, every metallic tremor. Every time the engine caught, roared, and pushed the 33-ton machine forward through terrain that would have stopped a lesser vehicle. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just 2 years ago, he'd been tuning up the same kind of engine on his father's farm, checking spark plugs, cleaning filters, keeping the old tractor alive through harvest. Now, that same design was carrying him straight into combat. The gunner fired. The recoil slammed through the hull, shaking loose a rain of dust and rivets. Outside, German shells erupted against the rocky ridges, and the air filled with the distant scream of Stukas diving from the clouds. Through the chaos, Daisy May kept moving. The engine never faltered. Later, when the smoke cleared and the Sherman crews gathered near the burned-out wrecks of Panzer IVs, Riley leaned against the still warm hull of his tank, helmet in hand. He could hear the engine ticking as it cooled like a living thing catching its breath. "She's one tough farm girl," he muttered, patting the armor. The mechanic beside him laughed. "Guess the Germans didn't expect to be whipped by a tractor." Across the Atlantic, back in Detroit, Charlie Nash read the after-action reports with a mix of pride and disbelief. The R975s had survived their baptism by fire. They weren't perfect, maintenance was constant, spare parts scarce, but they were working. The reports spoke of engines that refused to die, tanks that limped home on 5 of 9 cylinders, crews that used tractor tricks wrapping fuel lines, cleaning filters with sand to keep them running. For Charlie, these weren't just field notes. They were proof that his idea had worked. He pinned a telegram to the bulletin board in the plant cafeteria. Shermans performed admirably. Engine reliability excellent. Troops confident in power plant. Ordnance Department, North African Theater, the men cheered. Someone banged a wrench against a table. For a moment, the factory floor felt like a small-town barn dance, grimy faces breaking into smiles, soot-streaked hands clapping shoulders. It wasn't victory yet, but it was something close. By mid-1943, the Sherman had earned its reputation as the workhorse of the Allies. It wasn't the fastest, or the thickest armored, or the most powerful, but it was everywhere. From Sicily to the steppes of Russia, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Normandy, its familiar silhouette rolled forward under the power of those humble tractor-borne engines. In total, more than 50,000 Shermans would be built before war's end, and nearly half of them would carry the R975 radial at their core. A single design, born from the soil of the Midwest, was now fueling the largest armored campaign in human history. And as 1944 approached, that engine's toughest test was still to come across the English Channel, on a gray dawn the world would never forget. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The sea was a chaos of smoke and salt. Landing craft slammed through gray waves under a sky that burned with artillery flashes. Overhead, clouds hung low and heavy, torn apart by the distant roar of Allied bombers. Inside one of those landing craft, Staff Sergeant Tom Riley gripped the steering handles of his M4 Sherman, Daisy May II. The air was thick with diesel fumes and fear. Salt water sprayed through the open ramp, spattering across the tank's olive-drab hull. The engine behind him, the old Continental R975, rumbled like a beast in a cage, waiting to be unleashed. The ramp dropped. For a heartbeat, all Riley saw was water and fire. Then, with a jolt, the tracks bit into the sand. Daisy May II had lurched forward, waves slapping against her bow as the engine roared to life, coughing through the salt and grit. The machine that had once powered tractors across Iowa farmland now clawed its way through the surf of Omaha Beach. "Forward! Forward!" the tank commander shouted. The Sherman climbed the shore, passing shattered landing craft and men taking cover behind steel obstacles. Machine gun fire raked across the sand, sparking off the hull. The tank shook, but the engine didn't falter. Its rhythmic hum, steady, defiant, was the sound of American industry made flesh and iron. When they reached the seawall, Riley cut the throttle. The engine's roar fell to a deep growl. He glanced at the gauges, oil pressure steady, temperature climbing but safe. Through all the noise, through all the chaos, that one familiar sound, the same sound he'd heard in every harvest season of his youth, anchored him. It was home. Thousands of miles away, in Muskegon, Michigan, the Continental Motors plant was still running 3 shifts a day. Charlie Nash stood on the balcony above the assembly floor, watching a new batch of R975s being loaded into crates stamped overseas delivery. Each crate bore a simple stencil, U.S. Army, France. He'd stopped trying to count how many engines had passed through his hands. Tens of thousands, maybe more. But everyone carried the fingerprints of ordinary Americans, the welders, machinists, draftsmen, and line workers who'd turned the impossible into reality. When news of the Normandy landings reached the plant, production didn't stop. It only quickened. The workers cheered, then got back to work. Charlie looked down at the roaring engines below and whispered quietly to himself, "Get them home, boys. Just get them home." Back in France, Daisy May II rolled off the beach and into the Norman countryside. The hedgerows were thick and tangled, the roads narrow and slick with mud. The Sherman's engine, air-cooled and reliable, proved its worth again. While German tanks bogged down or overheated, the R975 kept running, even under the worst conditions. Riley's crew fought through villages that smelled of smoke and wet hay, past stone walls scarred by machine gun fire. At night, they'd park the tank under cover, pull open the rear access hatch, and listen to the engine tick and cool. It wasn't just a machine to them anymore, it was alive. The radial engine's distinctive hum became part of the soundtrack of liberation. French villagers would later describe hearing that deep, throaty rhythm echoing through the valleys before the first American tanks appeared. It sounded, one said, like the heartbeat of freedom. By August, the fields of Normandy were filled with hundreds of Shermans, many powered by those same engines born in the factories of America's breadbasket. The irony was almost poetic. The land that once grew Europe's crops was now being freed by the same technology that had once tilled America's soil. For Charlie Nash, that realization hit hard when he visited a returning unit in late 1944. A mechanic handed him a dented cylinder head from a Sherman that had fought from D-Day to Paris. "Still runs," the mechanic said proudly. "Lost half the plugs, cracked the housing, but she still runs." Charlie turned the battered metal over in his hands. It was scarred, blackened, ugly. But to him, it was beautiful, the proof that the impossible had been done. And as the Allies pushed east toward Germany, that same steady, faithful heartbeat of American industry would follow through mud, snow, and fire until the end of the war itself. March 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The night was cold and wet. A thin mist rolled over the shattered bridges and the silent ruins that lined the riverbank. The war was nearly over, but no one dared believe it yet. Across the water, the distant boom of artillery still echoed, like thunder refusing to die. Sergeant Tom Riley sat inside Daisy May II, parked beneath the skeletal remains of a bombed-out bridge near Remagen. The tank's hatches were closed, the smell of damp canvas and fuel heavy in the air. His hands rested on the control levers, fingertips black with grease. Behind him, the Continental R975 idled with a deep, rhythmic pulse, steady, dependable, the same as it had been since North Africa. Outside, engineers worked under the ghostly glow of floodlights, assembling pontoon bridges across the river. The sound of their tools carried through the fog, metal against metal, the heartbeat of an army on the move. "You think she's got one more push in her?" the gunner asked quietly. Riley looked around at the control panel, at the worn dials and scratched surfaces. He smiled. "She's a farm girl. They always do." When dawn came, the column moved out. One by one, the Shermans rolled across the floating bridge, treads clanking, engines roaring in chorus. It was an orchestra of mechanical defiance, hundreds of radial engines built for plows and tractors now driving straight into the heart of Germany. As Daisy May II reached the far bank, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Riley squinted against the light, watching the German countryside stretch before him, fields and villages that could have been mistaken for his own home, if not for the scars of war. He thought of the harvests left behind, the quiet mornings on the farm, and the machine that had somehow carried all of that, his past, his home, his country into the center of the greatest conflict in history. Back in the United States, in the spring of 1945, Charlie Nash stood once again on the floor of the Continental Motors factory. The war was drawing to a close, production orders slowing for the first time in years. Rows of unused R975 engines sat gleaming beneath the high windows, their metal surfaces catching the morning light. For the first time in 4 years, the factory was quiet enough that he could hear his own footsteps. He paused beside one of the engines, resting his hand on the cool steel. It was strange, he thought, how something so ordinary, so rooted in simplicity, had shaped the outcome of something so vast. When the telegram came announcing Germany's surrender, there was no cheering this time, only silence. A silence filled with exhaustion, relief, and the heavy knowledge of what those engines had endured and what they had cost. Charlie gathered his workers on the floor that afternoon. "We built engines," he said simply. "But what we really built was trust. Every man who drove a tank across Europe put his life in our hands, and we didn't let him down." No one spoke. They didn't have to. That summer, when Tom Riley returned home to Iowa, he found his father's old tractor still sitting in the barn, dust-covered but waiting. He climbed into the seat, turned the crank, and smiled as the small 4-cylinder engine coughed to life. The sound was different, quieter, gentler, but beneath it he could still hear the faint echo of the R975's growl. It was the same rhythm, the same soul. He leaned back, listening as the machine idled in the morning light. Out in the distance, the fields rippled with new growth. The war was over, but its heartbeat, the one forged in the factories, tested in the deserts, and proven in the mud of Normandy, would never fade. For every Sherman that rolled into battle, for every crew that made it home, there was a part of the American heartland beating beneath the armor, and long after the guns fell silent, that heartbeat remained, the sound of a farmer's engine that helped win a world war.